are held by the opposition party, not the government party, right? You need that recognition. You obviously need to create a good environment, have a good environment for job creation. You need realistic housing. Both the top two are Luanda. One as you've seen already. The one on the right is a Chinese-built city, but it's about 30 kilometres out with a hopeless road, and it's basically lived in by civil servants. Too expensive. Only civil servants can afford to live there, and they spend 6 hours a day driving, getting in and out. It's just horrible. South Africa's done a fantastic job in building low-income housing, but I think they really recognise they've built them in the wrong place. They're a long way out. People can't get to jobs. It's a real problem. The thing on the right is a site we visited in Dar es Salaam that the government was really proud of. It was opened by the president, but they're ridiculously expensive. Most of them were empty a couple of years ago on, and again, right out on the edge. The idea that the president is launching that as a national housing strategy is completely insane. Ethiopia is doing much, much better at building tenement blocks, where you are actually getting formal low-income housing at about $10,000 or $15,000 per unit. Although some of them are a long way out and a bit problematic. Do infrastructure early. One point I want to make here. Infrastructure's got all the obvious benefits, but it's also shaping expectations, right? A city's growing, but where's it growing? I don't know. City plan says it's there, but nobody believes a city plan. We've had 10 of those in the last 5 years, right? How do you shape expectations? If this coordination failure expectation thing matters, well, you build it. Capture the surplus. Public finance, we haven't talked about. I should have. Obviously, cities create surplus. Most of it goes into land value. Please give us property taxes. See the city as a whole. It's the last one. Okay. Piecemeal policy. Only gets you so far. The city is an interlinked economic system, and we really need to see it that way. And thank you for letting me overrun.
Thank you very much, Tony Venables. And I would like to move now straight on to Philip McCann, economic geographer, who was in Groningen for 9 years and is just left. Do you miss it yet already, Professor McCann? Do you? Yeah. Okay, the floor is yours. And then we'll have time for some questions.
This is a first for me, but I'm going to try and read my slides off my telephone because I don't have a laptop in front of me. So to avoid turning around too much, I'll also go using my phone. Firstly, of course, I'd like to thank the conference organisers. It's a real honour and privilege to be speaking in this event, and a place I feel very much part of me, very much part of my home and identity is being here. Secondly, I'd also like to thank Tony, who sent me the 2 papers on which a lot of his presentation was based, and also sent me his slides last week so I could have a think about them. And I remembered, Tony and I were just recalling earlier that 7 years ago we had a workshop here. We invited a group of people to Groningen just to think about the future related to issues related to economic geography, and Tony was talking about his early ideas and impressions in exactly this arena, and many of the things that he's talking about today, 7 years on, are actually operationalizing and making a huge amount of progress on these same issues. We had a great meeting, people here like Luke Dijkstra from the European Commission, Joachim Oliveira, Fabrizio Barca, Zoltan Ach, Matthias Ruth, Len Cook. It was a great meeting, and I just recalled many of these issues when I was reading Tony's slides, actually seeing that things that he was thinking about then he's actually working on. Also, just to say, Tony's work has heavily influenced many people in this room. He's worked on so many different things, and I think almost everybody here would say that there's some things that Tony's done that's heavily shaped how we we think about things. So in terms of how to respond and kind of pick up points here, going through the material that Tony gave me, there's so many ideas in here, so many of the issues, so many themes. So just to think about how in general do we connect with regional science and urban economics more broadly, the kind of issues that he's talking about, what are the things that pick up? Well, the first thing for me is basically to contrast the two arenas. So broadly, let's say the global north and the global south. So the kind of issues here that Tony's talking about, the issues in the global south, what are some of the key features? Well, city populations are growing very, very rapidly. Twice that of Europe, faster than parts of Asia. And migration is dominated by low income, so urbanization has these particular characteristics to it. Natural population growth, already we've heard, is greater than migration. We've got low capital investment shares. We've got a lot of urbanization without any real industrialization. We've got an absence of formal low-income housing. And we've also got an absence of formal and ordered planned systems in terms of land use systems, mechanisms, and patterns. If we contrast that with themes from the global north, which heavily dominate regional science and urban economics in terms of analysis, evidence, empirics, and have done for 50 years or so, we've got a very different story. If you look at the OECD countries, for example, many are growing very slowly. In fact, about a third of Europe's cities are actually shrinking in population. So this is a completely different experience. In terms of growth enhancing migration, what we're looking at in general is the movements of higher skilled people. Migration elasticities, propensities for migration, on migration, timing of mobility and so on. In the global north is primarily a high skill, high income phenomenon, again in marked contrast to the global south. Migration in general is higher than natural population growth in the industrialized global north. There are a few exceptions in the sense that migration, such as Central and Eastern Europe, for example, migration to cities like Warsaw or Bucharest has increased the natural population growth of those cities, but that's because they're largely young and high-income groups, so it's a shifting demographic. But whereas in the case that you're explaining, you're talking about natural population growth is bigger than migration or mobility, then it's the other way around in the global north. Of course, OECD countries and countries in general in the global north, we're talking about high levels of capital and human capital. And of course, we are all accustomed to a widespread provision of low-income housing in the formal sector. Indeed, many of our cities, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, the reconstruction such as following the Second World War, for example, has been defined by the planning systems and processes to provide widespread low-income housing in the formal sector. Finally, the only other common aspect, so basically my point is that the dominant features are completely the opposite. Probably the only one where there's a similarity now is those inverted U shapes you were showing, that manufacturing activities in cities today, in industrialized countries in global north, would be around 5 to 15% would be quite common. But of course they've gone through different stages. That's actually the only point of contact. All the others are orthogonal to each other. They're quite different sets. There are no connecting points, really. What does this raise? Well, of course, it raises a more general question when we're looking at development in different countries, particularly the kinds of places that Tony's talking about. Are we really looking at repeated patterns, or are we looking at actually new experience and analytical patterns? And this is important because of the issues that were raised in the 2009 World Development Report. Reshaping economic geography, because some of the arguments there, people were looking at kind of Kuznets, Rostock, Williamson, saying that there are kind of long-term deterministic patterns of development that we can point to. Whereas these kinds of experiences are new, they're brand new, in the same way as the development of China in the last 30 years. There's simply no precedent in history for that. And in the same way, these urbanization patterns of the type that Tony's talking about, there's actually no precedent, really, even looking at the industrialization history of parts of North America, countries like Australia, New Zealand, the European countries, or more recently, countries like Japan, Korea, and so on, Taiwan in the post-war era. There is actually no precedent for this. There are very, very few parallels. This is important because looking at long-run historical patterns is not necessarily helpful to us to discussing about this experience today. But there are a few things that, if you look back in the literature, actually jump out. One of them is the distinction between tradables and non-tradables. A lot of evidence, particularly in the last decade, coming out of the OECD, that the distinction between tradables and non-tradables is absolutely paramount because of this problem of getting caught in traps. Can you get over these steps? And of course, within regional science, this has a long history. The world of input-output, for example. We think about economic base, export base versus non-basic sectors. This kind of dichotomy is easy for teaching because people kind of get it very quickly and you can operationalize it. But actually, in the literature in regional science and in urban economics and in economic geography, a lot of those discussions have actually been ignored for the last 20 years. They went off the table because people tend to think in terms of agglomeration processes as being natural processes, which is very much a good news story regarding knowledge spillovers and so on. And the tradables, non-tradable thing is it kind of comes out in the wash. It's not really important. Whereas actually a lot of the earlier insights in economic geography, urban economics, regional science said these things are important. They're extremely important because they're about structure. Structure just doesn't happen naturally. There are thresholds, there's bifurcation issues, there's lots of stuff going on. Of course, new economic geography allowed us to tap into some of these things, and Tony, of course, was instrumental in that. And I think picking up these step problems of development says that, again, the specifics in each context matter. They really matter. And I'll give you an example of a fundamental difference. It would be something to do with global south, broadly, newly industrializing countries, let me use that phrase. One of the key features that we know is that population growth is faster than the ability of public authorities to provide any form of network infrastructures. Now that is the inversion of the economic history of countries like the Netherlands, the UK, the United States, most of Western Europe, and New World countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The ability to provide network infrastructure almost entirely predated population movements. All were in line with them. Whereas what we've got now is something which is completely different, where standard facilities that we would need in terms of transport infrastructure, electricity, clean water, decontaminated and contiguous plots of land that we take for granted in most countries, those basic requisites are not there. And the problem is, how do you do it? If I think in terms of the reasons for these global north, global south differences, of course, if I pick up the points that Tony's made, you know, what kind of issues are there? Well, there's poor land tenure systems, poor land and non-land regulatory problems. It's not just land, but it's interaction between land and other areas of the economy. Failure in capital, mortgage markets. Of course, these are also related to land markets. Lack of infrastructure provision, spatial planning as we think about them, of course, just implicitly assumes that all of these things are there. Or at least in a lot of our literature, it implicitly assumes these things. You mentioned a lack of a local tax base. In some countries, even a national tax base is very, very fragile, let alone a local tax base. Whereas many of our economies in the industrialized world, local taxes are a very, very important part of development, as well as national taxes. They work in a systemic way, kind of complementary roles. Of course, there are the downsides in many countries which are newly industrializing is the problem of regulation. And in particular, profits capture and poor governance are often related to land capture problems. And why is this important? Well, for me, the issue, and I think the wording in your presentation is exactly correct, is that the key feature that underlines the biggest difference between the global north and the global south is related to the mechanisms of land use and the working of land markets. And these are always political economy problems, and that's the language you're using. It's not an urban economic story, it's not a regional science story, it's not an environmental or an energy market story, it's a political economy problem. I'll give you an example in terms of the workings of informal land markets and urban growth. I haven't done nearly as much work on global south countries as Tony has, but I've done work on about a dozen different countries. Think about the textbook view of how we think about migration, agglomeration growth. In the global south, the kind of mechanisms we see interacting migration, land use and urban development are inverted in terms of the development process in the global north. So the global north, we would think about market signals, price signals, These are good places to invest, and you get financiers talking with real estate developers, lawyers. There'd be some sort of market negotiation process going on, a spatial planning interaction, governance processes. The real estate market starts to drive things, that develops price signals in terms of wages. People start moving in, and what we start to see is the agglomeration type of processes that we take for granted, and that Tony almost mentioned, or already mentioned. Exactly this kind of process. We think of them as basically being ubiquitous, because all these different price signals are connecting different markets. In the global south, it's often completely the opposite, the informal type of activities in land markets. So an example here would be, what is the trigger? Well, the first thing is, in many of these markets, there's an absence of any formal construction or real estate sector. There are real estate actors, there are real estate constructors, builders, but there isn't a wide and diversified market with a lot of liquidity and entry and exit possibilities that we would think about in those kind of markets in global north countries. So, for example, how does development work? Well, development works first by mobility. People move to the city. What do? Well, they move according to informal settlement processes. But it reverses the logic of land or site acquisition from how we think normally in a textbook type of model. How does that work? Because the logic is migration first, people move as long as they move in large enough numbers at the same time, day by day, week by week, they move so as to occupy land. So it's a squatting process. So the squatting process generates occupation in large numbers, which means that landowners are very rarely in a position to block the process. And the movers know that. So you go migration to occupation, and then the presence of many people in informal settlements, the kind of Lego structure you were talking about, Meccano structure, what does that lead to is the formation of informal settlements in a physical sense, shanty-town types of building. You go migration to occupation to formation, and then in the end, as long as enough people make those steps, in the end, landowners or often public authorities, in the end, are forced into network provision services. So you provide electricity, you provide sewerage systems, you try to provide water, and so on. So actually, it's completely the other way around. And curiously, in many countries, because landowners realize they can never recapture the land in some sort of asset sense, actually what often happens is you get entitlement transfers, that you also have an informal to formal creation of land rights. And there's different forms of this in different cities. They can be community-based. There are some examples of this in Latin America, individual-based in other countries. It depends. But the governance process emerges as the result of a completely different process, which is actually the reverse of the standard textbook type of approach. Why is this important? One, because it's happening. Two, the scale of this is gigantic. And three, it makes spatial planning as we think about it almost impossible unless you can get to that stage where public authorities or benevolent landowners are willing to intervene. And that's where the spatial planning process can come in. It's completely the opposite of how we would think about it, particularly here in the Netherlands, where spatial planning goes first. Otherwise, you get your feet wet. It's completely the opposite, but you see this is widespread. And so in general, what it leads to, the kind of issues that Tony's raising, actually lead to a lot of analytical challenges, which actually come back to our analysis that we would perform generally more or less in the, I would call the global north. So if I think of urban economics, regional science, environmental economics, economic geography, actually, since the 1960s, these fields have almost entirely ignored the workings of the land market. If you read a great book like Bortz and Stein, the factor allocation book from 1964, it's never mentioned. Harry Richardson's work, very, very nice, all those papers and books on regional economics, urban economics, it's never mentioned. There was work, 5 minutes, there was work in the 1960s, classical analysis on issues regarding land values, land value capture, rents in the real sense, understanding rents as in profits and so on. But basically, the focus on growth and agglomeration, which is our... Sorry, I hadn't realized I hadn't changed my slides. The focus on growth, which is our standard way of thinking, in a sense, has shifted attention away from thinking about the actual details of the mechanisms of land markets. Where we do think about these things, we tend to talk about congestion costs. As Steve Shepherd says, many of you know Steve Shepherd, congestion costs just mean things are going too damn well. That's Steve's description. The congestion costs are not necessarily a negative. There's many cases in industrialized countries where they're just a signal that things are going really, really well. Whereas the reality of negative costs and negative frictions of the kind that Tony's talking about, these are very real. But in our textbook models, basically what we implicitly assume is that land markets work. You have proper entitlement, proper enforcement of property rights. Everyone knows what the market game is and can access and understand those market property rights. They're transparent, there are formal settlement procedures. They pre-exist and underpin everything we do in urban economics and regional science in the global north, whereas in many parts of the global south, they simply don't exist. In some of the newly accession countries in Central Europe in the post-transition after 1989, then the formation of proper cadastral systems was absolutely the first thing that had to take place. And the Dutch were in the lead of this. We're very much about the formation of cadastral systems to regularize, to define, and to allow the enforcement of, and that included even things like decontamination systems of land using European cohesion funds. There had to be well-defined property rights so that people know what is being undertaken. And of course that's critical in order to get markets involved in terms of financiers, market makers, and so on. So we have some different difficult analytical challenges. One of them is when we think about land markets, the problem is different fields talk a different language. Planners, geographers, architects, finance people, economists, they all have quite different language about how we think about land markets. In regional science and urban economics, what we've tended to do is, because our models, you mentioned Mills, Muth, Alonso, of course, those models assume that we've got absentee landlords. And basically, you work out the real wage and the real land prices because you don't deal with the land value capture problems. You kind of externalize a lot of these. And so there's been a focus on efficiency in terms of consumption, amenities, location, and at the same time on production inputs. Land simply is another production input. But the problem is that in many of our industrialized societies today, migration, the signals for moving in and out of cities, actually migration is tiny relative to non-migration. Why is that? Because people have land as an asset. And it's what we don't talk about is the asset aspects of land. It's what makes financial markets work in real estate, but there's almost no analysis. If you look at Journal of Finance, for example, Journal of Financial Economics, Journal of Real Estate Finance and Economics, all these, there's actually nothing about ownership. It's all about mortgage repackaging, these kinds of efficient tools, but it assumes that these assets are well understood, they're clear, and so on. Whereas many of the asset and portfolio dimensions of land markets are almost independent of the consumption and efficiency arguments. You know, you see in the global financial crisis, what happens when people are frightened? They go back into assets that have got no growth whatsoever in terms of income. It's just safe. Why? Because asset ownership in terms of land is a portfolio problem. It's an asset problem, which means there are legal responsibilities, restrictions, covenants, exclusions, and there's also the whole issue regarding wealth, ownership and transfer through tax, let's call it tax efficiency, wealth generation, transmission mechanisms, savings and pensions. And all of these issues are specific to individual countries because the legal systems are different. The formation of the city is, as much as anything, a legal problem. And the problems we've got here are where the legal systems are not working sufficiently to allow the cities to grow. And one of the real insights of the Reshaping Economic Geography, the World Development Report, one of the profound insights is that simple structural regulatory problems are not sufficient. Even if you have really good regulatory systems, they're not sufficient to promote growth. Geography is part of that story because it's about coordination. So cities and governance and geography are all intertwined. And they're very complex interactions, and they're all brought together via the workings of the land markets. All the issues we think about, legal issues, compulsory purchase, land assembly, this is what lawyers do every day. We don't do that stuff. My point is, we have to find ways to do it. It's complicated, yes, but simply falling back on Mills, Muth, Alonso is simply ruling out
those mechanisms which are themselves driving so much of urban development, and that is true in the global north as well in the global south. It's just much starker in the global south, the role that these play. They are difficulties, but one of the difficulties of understanding this is also different legal systems are written in different languages. And it's not only understanding another language, it's understanding that other language in terms of legal arguments, which means the learning processes from different countries are actually very limited. That's on top of all the multiple goals, stakeholders, and so on. So a couple more minutes. So when we think about urban densification, the compact city agenda, this is largely driven by the energy environmental issues, health-related, amenity, and so on. There's lots of stuff out there, and I'm broadly very much in favour of these things. But I'll give you an example. In a compact city, we think about having things in the right place. We have urban economics models that can tell us a great deal about the growth performance of a city, how cities develop. So if you have prices going up, nominal prices or real prices ever, all you need is a small amount of price increase. You can put a zoning restriction, you've got a land barrier, and then the market prices are moving, so you're on the right side of the market to get financial investment, so you can understand how the process works. But in cities where you're facing population decline, for example, or out-migration, the market doesn't go into reverse. The market just collapses to a zero. It's like a singleton problem. Credit markets seize up, players disappear, and that can have implications for lots of other markets. Of course, central Detroit is probably the best example of this, where it's not only private finance collapses, but all the public finance based on land markets also collapses. And it means that actually, you look at our literature, there are many cases, not just issues around the global south, but also to do with things like population decline or the post-crash economy, particularly in southern Europe, where there's actually little or really no analytical guidance from the literature of how to think about these problems. Where you've got prices going in reverse, for example, or age-related issues which are complicated, how do we model bankruptcies, assets being shorted by international players in markets? Again, you need to think about all of the land contiguity, assembly challenges that public authorities face in order to help convert cities. And in the compact city literature, there's not much talked about these issues. As again, it's primarily on the energy, environmental, health related. That's all the good stuff, but these are the difficult things. So my final point is, what am I arguing? I'm arguing that in regional science and urban economics, whether we're working on the global south or the global north, we need to actually start to think a lot more again, as we did in the 60s, about the nature and the workings of the land markets. Why is it important? 3% of US real estate assets facing diminishing growth was enough to cause the global financial crisis. 80% of wealth globally is held in land and real estate, but they're absent from our models. There are links to whole other arenas, including public finance, because so many private balance sheets in non-real estate markets are also largely predicated on real estate assets. And in some sense, I think a lot of the insights of Piketty are right on here. He's very precise about the issue, whether you agree or disagree with his particular the way he's calibrated this. But the point is that he is arguing that increasingly wealth and prosperity is again moving back to land ownership in a way that the post-war industrialized world had moved away from. So, your point about land value capture. My starting point is always the Henry George theorem. We need tools and systems to capture land values, also for the public good of the people who themselves are being taxed. In many cases, it's the only way to provide infrastructure. Grand Central Station was a land value capture. I think the Copenhagen extension to the metro was another one. In history, there's many examples of this, but politically, they've gone off the agenda in many countries. It was actually mooted in the UK in the election as something related to health related. It wasn't very well done. But the point is that I think we need to go heavily back into this arena and think about the foundations of all of our models. And I refer to 3 documents that I think are very useful: the McKinsey Global Institute document on cities and demographic aging, and the 2 marvelous OECD documents published earlier on this year on the governance of land use in OECD countries and land use planning in the OECD, the country fact sheets. I would recommend everybody to read them. Okay, I'll stop there.
I must say, gentlemen, I was intimidated to hear that even though your field is already, seems to me, complex enough, you now also have to become legal experts, Mr. McCann. Good heavens. Can you join me here, please? Yeah. Professor Venable, one of the things that you said that struck me, and I hope that we'll have time for at least a couple questions for the audience, because we are now the only thing standing between the audience and a cold beer. That's a bad place to be. You talked about the city developing the wrong way, but it seems to me that so much of what we see in the Global South is not actually planned. It just happens. That's what informal settlement is. And your photo of Luanda was so eloquent in that respect. It's just one great big pancake of people who are desperate and who, for whom there are no provisions, and they just try to get by. So how can we transform this into an actual policy?
Yeah, saying the wrong way. Obviously, wrong is a dangerous word to use. It wasn't ascribing bad motives to anyone. It was just that.
I think we know what you mean.
That's what happens. But it's difficult to get to work from those places. It's difficult to deliver infrastructure, amenities, basic services. What do? No easy answer. I mean, it's understanding the land market and clarifying tenure. But there is a margin, a literal margin, where we really should be doing stuff, which is around the edge of these cities now, right? Once you're built, you're built. I mean, it's, you know, you're going to have to unpick it somehow. But around the edge of these cities.
And not 3 hours drive out, you mean?
Well, yeah, hopefully not 3 hours drive out. In the 1960s, the World Bank did a lot of sites and services projects where it just laid out sites and services. And people, you know, I mean, the land, you know, formal ownership, you know, land rights, a cadastre as part of that. And you know, development took place within that framework. And then part of this research project, we've had people looking at satellite images now of places that were laid out as sites and services in the 60s as against, you know, neighbouring places right next door that weren't. And there's a hell of a difference now. So start doing it on the edge.
Yeah. I was struck by the similarities in this sense between the global South and the global North. It sounded like you were talking about many American cities, I know. Drive till you qualify, we all know that.
Yeah, I mean, the density agenda is really important. And if you look at, you know, cities around the world, they've all got some density pattern, except Moscow and Brasilia and Johannesburg, where you can imagine the particular reasons why they've got stuff in the centre, then some gaps, then some stuff on the way out. Yeah. But obviously most cities, including, you know, Los Angeles, has got a density gradient. It's just if it was built in the golden era of the car, it's going to be incredibly flat, and that will become an increasing problem. Yeah.
But it's also built that way in places where very few people have access to cars. So that is a major difference. I have a lot. I could go on forever, but I'm sure you do too. Questions for our professors? Yes, I'll come to you in a moment, and you first. Could you stand up and tell us your name?
Sure. I'm Louis Dijkstra. I work for the European Commission. I had a question for Tony about the city model he was describing. I can clearly see how as the city grows, you need to grow vertically, and some of those residential dwellings might become office towers, but it probably also has an impact on the amount of space that you want to dedicate to networks, to especially road transport. And although I can think easy way of transforming a small house into a tall building, it's much harder to change a slum into a much wider road. Yeah. How do you address the issues in the center of that growing city rather than just at the edge? Thank you.
Can you use that mic, Professor Venables?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm just going to give the easy answer to that, which was on one of those sort of policy points at the end. You know, do infrastructure early. Yeah. evident affordability problems with that, right? Even if you've got your land tax, you've got to borrow, using future revenue as collateral. So, terribly, terribly hard to do. But retrofitting is horrendous. I was in Dakar a couple of weeks ago, and the average traffic speed there is 8 miles an hour now, kilometers an hour. Miles, I guess, in Dakar. Anyway, and going down to 3 or 4 predicted. So basically, walking will be faster than driving. And they're thinking of bus rapid transit, but the streets are not big enough for it to work. What do you do? One thing I talked a little bit about city edges, trying to capture it before it happens. But if you go back to those African numbers, at some point the discussion obviously has to become new cities, satellite cities, the Gorgions, whatever, Noidas, around the edge of towns. Very, very difficult. We know that many new cities have been disasters, but you saw the numbers.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Mike Barr. Phil knows me, Tony.
Hi.
I'm a student of Mazas. My question is more on both of you, which is a more perplexing problem, which is what happens in those countries where religion rules and doesn't allow, let's say the law of the land is neither a lender nor a borrower be. As Islamic countries in particular have this sort of thing, you can't tax, you can tax, but you can't have interest rates. And that will ruin the whole real estate market that Phil's suggesting we engage in. And so unless we can change the regimes there change, it would cause a particular problem. And this is true in Africa, as well as parts of Asia, which are some of the countries you're talking about, Tony.
Interesting, thank you.
Phil's
Mr.
going to
McCann, could you
answer
take
that
this one?
first.
I don't know about the specifics, so I can't comment specifically, but there is actually a literature in finance on Islamic finance. And if you think about some of the Islamic countries, are some of the fastest urbanization, the Gulf states, for example. So it's not simply, are these things possible or impossible? Many of those places have very well-planned cities and also driven by heavy infrastructure investment, both internally generated as well as externally financed. So it must be that those markets are working, but you'd have to look at people who work on this field. There is a literature in the financial literature on how these work.
One of my students was in Oxford, Pakistan, so she was having different problems getting national development there.
Any other questions? Yes, please, sir.
Yes, first, to Tony for a very interesting presentation. I'm Andres Rodriguez Posse from the London School of Economics. In your policy recommendations, one of the problems was that city governments were weak, and mainly because they were seen as a counterbalance for national governments, and national governments did not like that. But that implies probably more transfers of powers to some national governments, especially the city governments. But unfortunately, the evidence we have about decentralization in many developing countries, and I'm thinking about many Latin American countries, but also Indonesia, India, is not particularly good. There's a lot of graft, there's a lot of mismanagement, there's a lot of capacity problems. So, taking into account that many African cities have got institutional conditions that are far worse than the ones we can experience in those countries that have previously decentralized, to what extent can that be a solution to the problem?
To whom? Tony. Come forward, Tony.
Yeah, political. But political economy is at the centre of so much of this, and I know I didn't talk much about it, and yeah, it's obviously difficult. The sort of authorising environment you need for a city. Now, let's think about it for a moment. It's going to be spanning many functions. There's law, there's finance, there's sewerage, right? From the whole range of mundane city running the city, through building regulations, legal rights. So it's that huge range of functions. You need a long time horizon, evidently. You need quite a big city, quite a big geographical scope. If you think about cities expanding, we know there's a problem with neighbouring jurisdictions and cities with 3 different mayors because they've spread across jurisdictions and things. Okay, so you've got that going on, sort of underpinning it, and then the political economy, on top. What do you do? You need strong authority there somewhere. I'm just going to give some examples now. I mean, the obvious one, certainly the one I know best, is Kampala in Uganda, where there's a mayor who isn't that strong. There's a chief executive who's a member of the cabinet, the government cabinet, right? So you've had presidential involvement. In a sense, it needs to be getting the president really, really involved on these issues, seeing that the finance ministry has to allow the city to raise some revenue. So you need sort of presidential initiative to try and get some agency, with power. I mean, Lagos, I believe, in Nigeria is doing fairly well. It's fortunate Lagos City just happens to coincide with Lagos State, so that you have a man of power, right, who's running the show. Certainly, just saying, decentralised, give it to some tin pot little government that doesn't know anything and is open to graft is not a solution.
To the market.
I just restated the problem, I'm afraid. But
Hello, welcome.
Hi, thank you. My name is Budir Sosudarmo from Australian National University. First of all, thank you very much for the nice presentation from Tony and Phillips. It is very enlightening. I certainly agree with some of your policy recommendation related to capital, institution, and so on. But I do feel that I missed one issue, which is about migration outside the country, particularly what is our policy relating to easing people in Africa, for example, in which population booming, go out of Africa. Almost all regions experience this population booming, including Europe, but before the World War I and II, it is still, you have the access of finding a new work and so on, but after the World War II, those situation is not there anymore. You haven't mentioned those things because that $1 investment in other places could be much more efficient than $1 investment in Africa. So I would like to know your opinion on those things.
Good question, thank you. Is your question for Professor Venable or Philip? For both. Philip, can I give you the floor first? Can you use that mic? Can you join me here? Yours will be the last question.
Well, the migration issue, it seems to me it also depends on the selectivity, who's migrating. If the people who are leaving are generally more skilled, so if you've got people leaving the country who are more skilled, whereas people moving into the cities tend to be low skilled, then you're in a very difficult labour trap. And this has been a little bit the experience of some of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, where you've had rapid movements of people from rural areas into core cities, places like Sofia, Bucharest, Warsaw, but you've also had huge outflows of the most able and most skilled who are capturing the rents of actually the growth processes in other countries. So if there's a partial compensation system through repatriated incomes, this is also very common in countries like Australia and New Zealand, where people from South and East Asia move there and then there's a repatriation process. That may be significant, but there's no guarantee of that. So the kind of issues that Tony is talking about, where you've got urbanization, low levels of industrialization, but large increases in population but of low skilled, if there's no compensation systems to provide for outflows of higher skill, then potentially the system is very complicated. That would be my answer.
can I?
Very briefly, please. Then we're going to our last question.
I'm not going to give a sort of policy answer, but there are some sort of deep issues here to do with rent. I mean, we're increasingly rent-seeking, rent-ridden society, right? Now we all think, right, urban rent, should be taxed, right? It doesn't belong to me because of the fact I happen to own that bit of land. It's there because of the city. So definitely tax that. It's not mine. Why is Holland rich? because you're living off the rent accumulated in institutions and the rule of law and, you know, all sorts of social capital. Do you have a right to that, or should we tax it? Should we spread it more widely? I don't know. But there's some deep stuff here on
Even more?
on rent. Lots of stuff on rent to think about.
Please, our last question for today before we move to the reception. Could you join me?
Hold it. Thank you. Roberto Camagni from Politecnico di Milano. Thank you really to both of you for tracing this perfect picture of what is happening in these countries. I think that there should be added one big actor that is not so evident in your picture, which is the building and construction industry. Which accounts for the largest part of capital accumulation in these countries. So this industry is split, as the general economy in these countries, between an informal part, self-construction, and the formal, tradable, very evident and very efficient industry, which is building these big towers in the city centers, or even new towns in many countries, like Morocco, for example, big new towns, 400,000 people, you know, at a time. So the problem is that this industry is largely, and I would say 100%, in the hands of outside countries, in northern countries, offshore countries. This means that not just as you mentioned, land rent recapture is zero, as the property is mainly in the hands of the richer classes that generate the regulations and the rules. But also profits are not reinvested in the countries.
The kind of value capture.
And probably also them pay something like a rate of 0%.
Yet another factor in this already so complex story. Would one of you like to react?
Yeah, I mean, strengthening local construction industry is really important. Again, if you look at Africa, there's Chinese construction, some foreign construction, and self-build. So again, it's one of these astonishing things. There's no sort of medium-sized building sector. I mean, the history of London was interesting. There are a huge number of building companies, ranging from, you know, companies that built 1 or 2 houses a year to really quite big companies. I've got some copies of marvellous old handbooks telling you exactly how to build a third-class workingman's house. Right, this is the instruction guide and the pricing of all the materials. Anyway, it led to a vibrant construction sector. It's a real problem not having that. And just one other sort of, you know, anecdote-y random fact. You know, Africa's richest man is Mr. Dangote, who's worth 6 or 8 billion or something. But he made it, basically, he was the cement monopolist in Nigeria. It's a lot of money to make out of cement. So, you know, if there are problems lie in the construction industry, for sure.
Would you like to react, Professor McCann, finally?
I think your point, Roberta, is exactly correct. That's true in the global south, context that Tony's talking about. A lot of that is also true in the global north. You think about analysis, it's extremely difficult to do analysis on the real estate construction sector. One, it's very hard to get data. And two, I have actually had a paper with Arno van der Vlist, I don't know if Arno's here. It's very hard for us to get published because people say, oh, it's not interesting, real estate industry, construction, looking at innovation. We've got very, very detailed data, but it's not seen as an innovative type of sector, whereas actually it underpins all innovative activities. You've got to have the real estate investment underpinnings. But there are aspects also of the construction industry which are very hard to think about analytically. One of them is land banking, which is prevalent in all industrialized countries. There are portfolio behavior which are about stopping competitors in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And it's an area which is largely outside of our analysis, But in countries such as the UK, for example, it's a very, very widespread issue. It's less so, I think, in the Netherlands because there are some sort of enforcement procedures regarding building within certain time periods. But this is also an area where I think construction somehow has to be brought back into the model.
Well, you thought you'd heard so much today already, but what I learned from this is that we're only just beginning. It's a good thing you have another 3 days of the conference left. This was the opening session. I want to thank our introductory speakers and our keynote speakers for their illuminating talks. And thank you for being with us, for your passion and your interest for this field. And let's go have a beer.
Bier, dat ruikt je al.
Ja,